The square was still empty when the guards assembled at dawn, stone walls holding the cold like a held breath, Rome not yet awake to what would soon unfold. Torches burned low, their light trembling against iron fittings and dark wool cloaks, and at the center of it all stood a single figure, restrained, silent, already separated from the world he had once challenged with words alone. Giordano Bruno did not look like a conqueror or a soldier, yet the machinery gathered around him carried the same deliberate purpose as any battlefield formation. This was an operation planned over years, executed by institutions that understood patience, logistics, and psychological pressure with a precision that would have been familiar to any military commander. Nothing about this morning was spontaneous. Every step, every delay, every silence had been calculated long before the sun rose. 7 years earlier, Bruno had been taken into custody not with violence, but with procedure. No sudden charge, no public spectacle. He was isolated, transferred, cataloged, and slowly absorbed into a system designed to exhaust resistance over time. In military terms, it was a siege rather than an assault. The goal was not immediate destruction, but submission through attrition. Removed from allies, denied the reinforcement of open debate, Bruno was placed into an environment where the only variable was endurance. His captors understood that ideas, like fortified positions, rarely fall to a single blow. They collapse when supply lines are cut, when morale erodes, when time itself becomes a weapon. Bruno's background made him particularly dangerous to the authorities of his era. He was trained, disciplined, and intellectually mobile, moving through Europe with the adaptability of a seasoned operative. France, England, the German states. He absorbed ideas, challenged doctrines, and refused to anchor himself to a single patron. In an age when loyalty was expected and deviation punished, Bruno's independence marked him as unpredictable. He did not merely disagree. He reframed the entire operational map of the universe. Infinite worlds, no fixed center, no single axis of authority. To the Church, this was not philosophical curiosity. It was a destabilizing theory, capable of undermining command structures that relied on absolute hierarchy. The Roman Inquisition approached this case methodically. Interrogations were not rushed. Questions were repeated months apart. Answers compared. Inconsistencies noted. Bruno was given opportunities to recant, not out of mercy, but because confession would validate the system itself. A public reversal would serve as proof of institutional dominance, much like forcing an enemy commander to sign terms of surrender. Each refusal hardened Bruno's file. Each clarification of his beliefs was recorded with the care of after-action reports, documenting exactly why compromise would not be possible. Inside confinement, time became indistinct. Days blurred into a cycle of waiting, questioning, and silence. This was psychological terrain warfare. Without open brutality, the pressure remained constant, invisible, and draining. Bruno's physical condition deteriorated, but more significant was a sustained attempt to fracture his certainty. He was confronted with theological authorities, legal scholars, and former allies who had chosen survival over conviction. The message was consistent. Compliance meant release, resistance meant obliteration. Yet Bruno continued to respond with measured calm. He did not shout. He did not beg. He explained. That restraint unsettled his captors. They were accustomed to emotional collapse, to desperation, to the predictable arc of fear. Bruno offered none of it. His composure suggested something more difficult to defeat than defiance. It suggested belief reinforced by internal logic rather than external approval. For an institution built on visible obedience, this was a strategic nightmare. You can defeat an army by breaking formation. You cannot defeat a lone thinker who has already accepted isolation as the cost of truth. As years passed, the political environment shifted, but Bruno's position did not. New officials reviewed his case, hoping distance might soften him. It did not. Each review ended the same way, with recommendations for continued confinement. By the 6th year, the objective had changed. Conversion was no longer the primary goal. Containment and eventual elimination became the only viable outcomes. In military doctrine, this is the moment when an asset is deemed irrecoverable. Outside the prison walls, Europe moved toward conflict and consolidation. States strengthened borders, faith hardened into identity, and deviation became synonymous with threat. Bruno's ideas, though confined on paper and memory, represented a vulnerability that authorities could not afford to leave unresolved. His continued existence was a signal, however faint, that resistance was possible. For institutions that ruled through certainty, even a whisper of doubt carried unacceptable risk. By the time the final judgment was prepared, the outcome was inevitable. The process had run its course. Documentation was complete. Appeals exhausted. Bruno was informed not with outrage, but with formality. The system did not need to justify itself. It simply advanced to its final phase. Like a campaign reaching its terminal objective, all that remained was execution. On the morning he was brought out, Bruno reportedly refused final concessions. Not loudly, not theatrically, simply completely. In that refusal lay the reason this moment still echoes through history. He was not a warrior in armor, but he faced institutional force with the same resolve as any soldier holding ground against overwhelming odds. The square would soon fill. The crowd would come. The operation would conclude. But the ideas that had sustained him through 7 years of calculated pressure would not be so easily erased. The crowd arrived gradually, not in a rush but in clusters, drawn by rumor and routine rather than passion. Executions in Rome were not rare, and familiarity dulled outrage. Vendors positioned themselves at the edges of the square, guards established clear lanes, and officials moved with rehearsed efficiency. This was not chaos. It was administration. Like a military parade, every element served a purpose: visibility, control, deterrence. The presence of the public transformed the act from punishment into message. Bruno, standing at the center of this carefully managed environment, was no longer merely a prisoner. He was an example. The authorities understood the psychology of spectacle. A punishment unseen achieves nothing beyond removal. A punishment witnessed reinforces discipline. Bruno's long confinement had neutralized his immediate influence, but his execution would serve a broader strategic objective. It would remind scholars, clerics, and thinkers that deviation carried consequences extending beyond the individual. Ideas could be debated quietly, but once they threatened structure, they would be met with finality. This was not vengeance. It was doctrine enforcement. Bruno's physical state reflected years of deprivation, yet there was no visible panic in his posture. Observers noted his stillness, the way his gaze moved across the square without fixation. He appeared to be assessing rather than reacting, as if mentally cataloging the scene. For a man who had spent years in confined spaces, the open air did not bring relief. It brought clarity. The process was complete. There would be no further negotiations. Officials read the formal charges, their voices steady, language precise. Heresy, refusal to recant, persistent deviation. Each phrase was the product of committees, reviews, and approvals. This was the legal equivalent of firing order, signed and countersigned until responsibility dissolved into institution. No single voice claimed ownership of a decision. The system spoke as one. Bruno was offered a final opportunity to align himself with accepted doctrine. The phrasing suggested mercy, but the structure allowed none. Acceptance required full submission, not partial concession. Bruno declined. Accounts differ on his exact words, but the meaning is consistent across records. He would not deny what he believed to be true. His refusal was neither dramatic nor hostile. It was controlled, final, and absolute. That moment marked the true climax of the operation. Everything that followed was procedural. The psychological battle, the attempt to reclaim, redirect, or neutralize his conviction, ended there. From a strategic perspective, Bruno had forced the institution into its final option: elimination. The execution itself was carried out with restraint, deliberately avoiding chaos. Guards maintained distance between Bruno and the crowd. There was no struggle recorded, no disruption. This was intentional. Disorder would undermine the authority of the act. Silence and order reinforced it. The absence of spectacle in the physical sense intensified the symbolic weight. What mattered most to the authorities was not Bruno's body, but the containment of his legacy. His writings had already circulated, some banned, others hidden. The execution aimed to sever the connection between the man and the ideas, to render both inert through finality. Yet history demonstrates that suppression rarely achieves that objective. By elevating Bruno to the status of a condemned thinker, the institution inadvertently ensured his permanence. In the days that followed, official records closed his case. Files were archived. Personnel moved on to other matters. From an administrative standpoint, the issue was resolved, but among scholars and quiet dissenters, Bruno's execution became a reference point. Not immediately, not publicly, but persistently. His refusal to yield under prolonged pressure was noted, discussed, and remembered. From a broader historical perspective, Bruno's story reveals the operational limits of institutional power. Systems excel at managing populations, enforcing norms, and eliminating visible threats. They struggle against individuals whose resistance is internal rather than organizational. Bruno commanded no followers, led no rebellion, organized no movement. His danger lay entirely in coherence. His ideas formed a complete framework that did not require external reinforcement. The long duration of his confinement underscores this point. If Bruno had been considered weak, the process would have ended quickly. The 7-year span reflects uncertainty within the institution itself. Authorities hoped time would succeed where argument had failed. It did not. That failure forced a decisive response. In later centuries, Bruno would be reframed as a symbol of intellectual courage, a martyr for freedom of thought. That narrative, however, simplifies the reality. He was not seeking martyrdom. He was seeking consistency between belief and expression. His execution was not the result of reckless provocation, but a sustained refusal to compromise foundational convictions. For a modern audience, especially those familiar with military history, Bruno's ordeal resembles a prolonged resistance under occupation. Cut off, isolated, pressured, and offered repeated chances to surrender. He held position without reinforcements. His endurance was not physical dominance, but mental discipline. In that sense, his story belongs alongside accounts of individuals who faced overwhelming institutional force and chose principle over survival. The square eventually emptied. Life resumed. Rome continued. But the silence left behind carried weight. The operation had achieved its immediate objective, yet it had also exposed a vulnerability. Ideas, once articulated and defended with consistency, do not die easily. They adapt, migrate, and reemerge under different conditions. Bruno's execution closed a chapter, but it did not end the conflict between authority and inquiry. It merely shifted the terrain. And in that shift, Bruno achieved something the institution could not fully control: permanence. In the years immediately following Bruno's execution, there was no public reassessment, no acknowledgement of doubt from the authorities who had overseen his case. Institutions of that era did not revise outcomes. They reinforced them. Official silence was deliberate, intended to prevent his name from becoming a rallying point. Mentions were minimized, references restricted, and discussion discouraged. This was containment doctrine applied after action. Deny oxygen to any lingering influence. Yet suppression does not erase memory. It only pushes it into less visible channels. Bruno's writings survived not because they were protected, but because they had already dispersed. Manuscripts passed quietly between scholars. Fragments copied by hand. Arguments paraphrased in safer language. His ideas were rarely attributed directly. Instead, they reappeared as questions rather than declarations. This diffusion made them harder to target. Unlike a single identifiable threat, a dispersed concept cannot be neutralized with force. It requires counter-argument, something the institution had already attempted and failed to achieve. From a strategic perspective, this was an unintended consequence of prolonged pressure. The 7-year confinement had given Bruno's ideas time to circulate beyond his control. Had the response been immediate and absolute, the damage might have been contained. Delay allowed propagation. In military terms, the failure was not in execution, but in timing. By the time decisive action was taken, the operational environment had already shifted. Among intellectual circles, Bruno became a reference case rather than a hero. His fate was cited quietly as a warning and a benchmark. Scholars measured their own positions against his, calculating how far deviation could go before drawing institutional response. This created a form of adaptive behavior. Ideas did not retreat. They evolved. Language became coded. Challenges were framed indirectly. The confrontation between authority and inquiry continued, but with greater sophistication. Centuries later, as political and scientific revolutions reshaped Europe, Bruno's name resurfaced with greater clarity. He was retrospectively assigned significance, cast as an early figure in a broader movement toward intellectual autonomy. This reassessment often stripped away the operational reality of his ordeal, replacing it with simplified symbolism. The truth was more complex. Bruno was not a passive victim swept up by forces beyond his understanding. He was an active participant who understood the risks and accepted them deliberately. What distinguishes Bruno from many historical figures is the duration of pressure he endured. 7 years is an extended engagement by any standard. Most systems rely on rapid resolution, either compliance or removal. Prolonged resistance introduces uncertainty. It consumes resources, attention, and credibility. Each year Bruno remained unbroken, undermined the assumption that authority inevitably prevails. His persistence forced the institution to confront its own limitations. There is also a tactical lesson in how Bruno was managed. The absence of overt brutality during much of his confinement was intentional. Excessive force risks generating sympathy. Subtlety minimizes backlash. Yet subtlety also leaves room for internal strength to assert itself. Bruno's captors underestimated the resilience of a belief system built on internal logic rather than external validation. They treated his conviction as a position that could be negotiated. It was not. For modern observers, especially those familiar with military or intelligence operations, Bruno's case illustrates the challenge of neutralizing non-physical threats. You can disrupt networks, dismantle organizations, and remove leaders. You cannot easily dismantle a coherent worldview once it exists independently of its originator. Bruno required no followers to remain dangerous. His danger lay in precedent. He demonstrated that resistance did not require force, only consistency. This is why his execution, though final in a physical sense, failed strategically. It removed the individual but confirmed the conflict. Authority revealed that it was willing to eliminate rather than persuade. That admission weakened its moral position over time, even if it secured immediate compliance. Long-term stability depends not only on enforcement, but on legitimacy. Bruno's death introduced doubt into that equation. The legacy of his ordeal extends beyond philosophy or theology. It speaks to the dynamics of power, control, and dissent across history. Whenever an institution encounters an individual who refuses to align despite sustained pressure, the response follows a familiar pattern. Isolation, negotiation, delay, elimination. Bruno's story is an early, well-documented example of that cycle. In later generations, monuments and memorials would frame Bruno as a champion of free thought. While this recognition restores his name, it risks oversimplification. The true weight of the story lies not in posthumous honor, but in the prolonged uncertainty that preceded his death. Those 7 years represent a sustained test of institutional authority against individual resolve. The outcome was not as decisive as it appeared. Even now, Bruno's case challenges assumptions about control. It forces acknowledgement that systems, no matter how disciplined, face inherent limits when confronting internal conviction. Force and silence expression, but it cannot erase coherence. That lesson, learned repeatedly across centuries, remains relevant wherever power confronts dissent. By the time history reassessed Giordano Bruno, the world he challenged had already begun to change. Scientific inquiry expanded, cosmology evolved, and the rigid structures that condemned him slowly adapted or fractured. His execution did not halt that progress. If anything, it highlighted the cost of resisting it. The endurance of his ideas is not accidental. It is a predictable result of a system choosing elimination over engagement. Bruno's story endures because it exposes that choice and its consequences, not as legend but as operational reality. By the time Giordano Bruno's name fully re-entered public consciousness, the world had moved into a different operational environment. Authority no longer rested solely on inherited doctrine. Empirical observation, experimentation, and decentralized inquiry had begun to reshape how truth was validated. In this new context, Bruno's ordeal was no longer interpreted as an isolated act of enforcement, but as an early warning of what happens when institutions attempt to suppress structural change rather than adapt to it. His execution was reclassified from necessity to error. This reassessment did not happen quickly. For centuries, Bruno remained a marginal figure, referenced occasionally but rarely examined in full. When he was mentioned, it was often selectively, with emphasis placed on fragments of his philosophy rather than the sustained pressure he endured. Only later did historians begin to analyze the full duration and mechanics of his confinement, recognizing it as a deliberate, prolonged operation rather than an impulsive act. That shift in interpretation reframed Bruno not just as a thinker, but as a case study in institutional response to existential threat. What becomes clear under this lens is that Bruno's resistance was never about provocation. It was about refusal to retreat from logical conclusions once they had been reached. He did not escalate. He did not organize. He did not seek confrontation. He remained consistent, for power structures relying on compliance. Consistency without compromise is destabilizing. It leaves no room for partial victory. Either the individual yields or the system must act decisively. The decisive action taken against Bruno achieved surface-level control but failed to achieve strategic closure. His death removed a visible anomaly, yet left unresolved the underlying tension between authority and inquiry. Over time, that tension manifested elsewhere, in new figures, new conflicts, and new institutions facing similar challenges. Bruno's story became a quiet reference point, a reminder of the costs incurred when dialogue is replaced by force. From a long-term perspective, his execution represents a miscalculation. It assumed that eliminating the source would eliminate the signal. History demonstrates the opposite. Suppression often amplifies significance by transforming individuals into symbols. Bruno did not seek that role, but the conditions of his removal assigned it to him. His endurance under pressure became inseparable from his ideas, reinforcing them rather than diminishing them. In modern analysis, particularly among those familiar with command structures and strategic decision-making, Bruno's case illustrates the importance of adaptability. Rigid systems perform well in stable environments, but struggle during paradigm shifts. When faced with fundamentally new frameworks, enforcement alone cannot restore equilibrium. It can only delay change, often at the cost of legitimacy. Bruno's 7-year ordeal highlights another critical factor. Time does not always favor authority. Prolonged engagements drain resources, expose uncertainty, and create opportunities for unintended consequences. Each year of his confinement increased awareness, spread ideas, and hardened positions on both sides. What was intended as a slow path to compliance became a prolonged demonstration of resistance. Today, Bruno's legacy is less about the specifics of his cosmology and more about the conditions under which he was silenced. His story resonates because it mirrors patterns seen repeatedly across history. When institutions encounter ideas that challenge foundational assumptions, they often respond defensively. The initial instinct is control, not integration. Bruno's fate shows where that instinct can lead. The monument erected centuries later at the site of his execution stands not as a celebration of rebellion, but as an acknowledgement of institutional failure. It recognizes that authority, when threatened, chose elimination over engagement. That acknowledgement, delayed as it was, represents a form of resolution unavailable at the time of his death. For audiences accustomed to studying military history, Bruno's story offers a parallel lesson. Victory defined solely by removal of the enemy is often incomplete. True resolution requires understanding why the conflict emerged and whether the response addressed its root causes. In Bruno's case, it did not. The execution ended a man's life, but accelerated the transformation of the intellectual battlefield. Giordano Bruno did not live to see the world validate aspects of his thinking. He did not receive recognition, rehabilitation, or vindication in his lifetime. Yet his endurance altered the trajectory of discourse in ways his captors could not fully anticipate. His resistance, quiet and sustained, demonstrated that ideas grounded in internal coherence can outlast systems designed to suppress them. In the final assessment, Bruno's execution stands as both an endpoint and a beginning. It closed a file but opened a precedent. It resolved the case but intensified a conflict. His story endures not because of spectacle, but because of structure. The structure of power confronting conviction, and the consequences of choosing force when adaptation is required. History records the outcome, but also records a cost. And in that cost lies the true legacy of Giordano Bruno.